Welcome to the Meeple Syrup Aftershow. Designers discussing design. We're on episode 83, Ready Player One. We had a great show. I have so much to say. I know both Tiffany and Sen do as well.
You better believe it.
Really great stuff. We were talking player count and how that uh, interacts or feeds design, and how, what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Things like what makes a good game work with different player accounts. We talked a lot about scope and not the mouthwash type. But I don't want to take up any more time. I know we ran a little late because we had the exciting news of the dojo have four members in the dojo for season 1 of the dojo game dojo, where Sen is going to be mentoring a few up and comers. Maybe before we go into this episode, just again, maybe a quick plug if anyone didn't catch that. Sen, can you just give a quick
Sure.
a quick summation of what you're going to hopefully do with the dojo, so that maybe people will get ready for season 2?
Yeah, so for season 1, we have 4 applicants who are successful in their bid to try to get a game somewhere further than what it is. Doesn't necessarily mean publication, but hopefully, if that's their goal, that's where we're going to try to get them. So it's Ryan Schoon, Bob Wyman, Devin Stinchcombe, and Steve Kyres, who will be getting some hopefully helpful advice from me. We'll do some playtesting together. Hopefully, they'll learn how to maybe use Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia so we can do it remotely, or send print and plays back and forth, that kind of thing. And then also, through contacts, maybe we'll get some surprise guests online every now and then. So the process is going to be playtest, reiterate, but then also have conversations online. So we'll have viewers watching us live interact, me asking questions of the designers, how'd your playtest go, that kind of thing. So it'll be a little bit of reality TV, totally unscripted.
So a little chance for people to kind of
Yeah.
tag along for the ride.
Yeah, so almost like I'm Jiminy Cricket, and I'm like the voice on the shoulder saying, "Steve, you should have thought of this," right? And then Steve will go, "Oh, I
Nice.
should have thought of that."
Nice.
But I'm sure a lot of the games are in a good state, and we're just aiming to make it a little bit better. And this gives you guys a little bit of an insight into the process that the Game Artisans of Canada go through. So every member who has full artisan status has pretty much in the last 5 6 7 years gone through this process in some way, shape, or form, where we take somebody from a journeyman to an artisan, and then hopefully to wherever they need to go in terms of publication. So again, the goal is not publication, but it should lead towards something like that. So on that note, let's get back to this after show, which is about player count.
Yeah. Well, there's just so much. Let's just pick something and go from there. Let's maybe the first topic I want to get into, and there's stuff that we didn't even get to on the episode I'd love to talk about. But first, let's just talk about the discussion of scope and chaos. I thought those were really important terms. And I know Tiffany, for instance, was taking lots of notes. Let's talk a little bit about. I had the opportunity of listening to the podcast that was referenced, but for you two, what stuff did Gil bring up from that jumped out at you that you think designers need to catch or hear? Is there anything you want to add to it or echo so that our viewers really hear some of the great stuff that was discussed?
Well, there's one thing that he said very early on in the show that made me get out my notebook and start taking notes, and I even tweeted it because it was a great quote, and that is, different player counts are essentially different games. I think that's huge, and it's one of those things that I definitely have felt before while playing games and reviewing games, but he phrased it so well, and it just kind of clicked for me that it's true. And then we went through on different player counts, and we talked about how different player counts are essentially different design elements in games. So that was the huge takeaway for me. It was like mind blown.
Nice.
Yeah, my favorite thing was when we were talking about, even just on the box, like, don't lie on the box. And sometimes you feel like you're kind of lying on the box. So I'll even give an example of my game. Jay and I designed Belfort, obviously, and that's a game that we love. And we were asked by the publishers very specifically, we can't just say 3 to 5. We want to say 2 to 5. Can you make a 2-player variant? And that idea of saying 3 to 5 with a 2-player variant is much more transparent. And it's much more honest to the buying audience, because a lot of people got the game thinking they could play it with 2, and the rules for 2-player are almost exactly the same, but they have the quote-unquote evil bot, right, where you use other pieces that
Yep.
you're not totally in control of to actually play the game. And it turned a lot of people off of the 2-player game, which is unfortunate, because the 2-player game in Belfort is actually awesome. If you ever get a chance to play
Yeah.
it, give it a shot, because
It's very good.
there's a whole other level of strategy. If you're into area control and you like 2-player games, this is one where the way that Belfort works, because you jockey between control halfway through your turn on placement versus turn order. If you can play it really well, and you can actually switch which of the bots you're taking control of, then you have a whole new game. And it's only when you realize that you go, oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of strategy, and I think that people had a false expectation, like you're mentioning.
Sure.
But if people go in with, it is a different game, it is a different experience. There's a lot of strategy to be had for Belfort 2-player. I really enjoy it. I mean, most people know Belfort's one of my favorite games, and that was actually how Sen and I met. Was I threw a Belfort party, so I am a big fan of that. And I think that gets me into a topic that I'm really interested in. And we didn't talk a lot about it, but this idea of
well, let's do it now. Let's do it now.
Now, certain types of games are better with different player counts. And you mentioned area control, and how Gil even mentioned, something like area control usually begs more players for it to be good. You need enough different moving pieces. And I'm curious, what other mechanics do you see that lend themselves better to different player counts? I would love to talk a little bit about that, and then maybe breaking that rule. What games do we wish are out there that did it better? For instance, I love area control, and I would like to see more games do 2-player with area control better. It's always easy to say, well, add more people to fight over area and it's more fun, but I would like to see more people take on the challenge of also maybe breaking the rules. So what do you guys see are certain mechanics that lend themselves better for more or less? Another example that was in our last episode was battle games. So games with fighting and interaction like that often lends itself to more players. But what do you think, Tiffany or Sen, are some mechanics that lend themselves to different player counts?
Good question. Tiff, you want to hit that, or you on?
I can start it off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so the thing that Gil mentioned, I mean, I'm just going to be talking about how awesome Gil is this entire after show. But one of the things that Gil said that really hooked me was when he started talking about the scope, and I know this was from another show, the local scope versus global scope. And I was thinking about it, and the games, a lot of 2-player games that are designed specifically just for 2-player, some of Steve and I's favorite titles are ones where it's very local scoped. So in that regard, it's what some people refer to as sandbox games. Mm-hmm. And a lot of games which are sandbox games, I feel that they scale better to larger player counts more easily, but they also just limit player interaction. So an example would be Agricola. Agricola works just as well 2-player as it does other players, because they just add more action spaces available to every player. And so the global scale grows at the same ratio as the player count, but you're mostly focused on just what you're doing in your own player area. And so the more I think about that, the more I realize there are games that I think that's almost become, it's like a standard formula almost. I don't want to say formula, but it's like it's a standard mechanic that I see in a lot of games that do that 2-player. Good games that do 2-player and can scale up. It's games that generally have a more local scope as the main focus of what you're doing. And then the global just scales with the number of players, either based on how many action spots, like viticulture. You have a number of action spots that are available depending on player counts. So the global scope just scales.
Sure. Absolutely. I'll jump in. I mean, one that I think is a very common one and seems almost like every design I've seen in the last year has kind of gone to this tool in the tool chest, but simultaneous selection. A lot of the times, if it's simultaneous selection, then you have a good idea of how long the game's going to play, because it doesn't matter how many players are going, you're always playing kind of the same amount of total turns, or it's slightly adjusted so that you have a similar expectation. And Seven Wonders is obviously one of the classic examples of a game that can scale fairly high up to 7 without, technically running too much longer, even though you have lots more players. So I think that's an example that we're seeing a lot of. I mean, I can think of like Boyan was on the show one time, and he talked about how basically every game he designs, he tries to think of simultaneous selection in some aspect of a game. That's kind of one of his trademarks. Or I've talked to other designers where they find that's an easy example or a tool they can use to address things like games running too long or outstaying their welcome. Especially with higher player counts, because if you do have a lot of people waiting turns, that downtime can be quite brutal.
Yeah.
It's funny because I know Daryl has another opinion of downtime than some of us do. He actually likes some downtime in order to think, right? And I think that's warranted. What you end up with in a lot of cases where the game design is simultaneous action is you kind of almost get that feel of like there's a rush to do it.
Yep.
And that's unfortunate in games where you need to be a little more thoughtful. So I think, the mechanics have to meld very well with the amount of information that we're expecting the players to actually get, to grok, that grok word, right?
Sure.
And so definitely at higher player counts, if the stuff is simple, like literally on a card of Seven Wonders, what is it? It's an icon or two, and then what path it actually took, right?
Yeah.
So there's what it produces, what it takes to make it, and then did you get it for free or not, and the color of what type it is. That's about it. And you can digest psychologically that type of information in a split second because it's less than the 7 plus or minus 2 bits that we often talk about in cognitive science, which is not really
you're doing it over and over again, so it's you're already kind of warming yourself up throughout the game, because you're looking for that same information. You know where to look. You're building that habit.
One thing that I often enjoy, I like Take That more than a lot of people do. So I enjoy fighting games and things like that. And a lot of them are basically like they're 2-player games. Or very often 2-player games. So even, like BattleCon or even Jeff Engelstein's new one, Fog of War, it's a 2-player game because adding that third player into the mix makes it into that weird thing where you cannot calculate what's going to happen, or could end up being that let's dump on one player to really eliminate it, to make it a 2-player game, right? And so Jesse and I, when we work on fighting games, because we often do work on fighting games where there are more than 1 or 2 players, there's 3 or 4, our solution to that so far has been things like you only target the person to your left, and the game ends when one player eliminates the person to their left, that kind of thing. So it really is it's almost like it's a kludge in some ways, or a fix that is, okay, we took this 2-player game and just made it into many little 2-player games. But then we have ways to interact with the other players, what they're doing through the game, just not the direct take that part of it. So I'd like to try to do more. I think Daryl, what you're saying in terms of area control, I think we could actually solve that if we use the Belfort mechanic just in a little more upfront way, that you are picking allies. And each turn, your allies could turn or change depending on what you do. And those allies are helping you get the territories, but they could really literally turn coat, right? And become the allies of your opponent the next turn. So you have to be aware of all of that. And I think that could make a really dynamic area control game.
Absolutely. Another topic that came up, which I'm fascinated by, and we didn't get to talk too much about it, especially us, is the 3-player only game. And I think it's fascinating that, especially Jeremy and David both talked about how if a game's only 3 to 5 players, or if it's 3-player only, those are games that are low on their totem pole for what they thought they'd play or even review, which is hilarious because at other times they mentioned how their favorite player count was 3 with some of their Euro games. So clearly people play 3-player games a lot. I mean, at
there are games I will only play with 3 players.
Yeah, so we're already playing games often with 3, but there's this stigma almost attached to this game that can't play 2. Yet there's games that I own that I bought with the fact that it played 2 to something, but I've never played it as 2 because I never would anyways. So it's funny that there's a stigma there. What do you think that's attributed to, and do you think that'll change?
I honestly don't know, because I have a similar stigma, especially because Steve and I, most gaming that we do, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna move my camera up, because I'm sitting more forward now. Most gaming that we do is 2-player, and if we're not playing 2-player, we play 3-player. But we actually are doing a massive. We've instigated a rule in our collection where if the game doesn't support 2-player, like if it's 3 to 5 on the box, it has to be amazing as 3 to 5. Because if not, we're gonna get rid of it. Because and the same thing goes with purchasing. Like, we will not purchase a game anymore that says 3 to 5 unless we have played it already.
Right.
Because it's one of those things where it's like the limitation of, and there are games that we have that can play 2-player that we've never actually played 2-player, but we're keeping them around because they can. It's kind of a weird.
Well, because you still have hope that they're going to be great, but maybe.
Well, yeah, and there's still the hope that, like, there's the chance that if somebody comes over and we really want to play this game, we can play it. But if they end up not coming over and we still want to play it, we can still play it 2-player.
I mean, Sen has a notorious collection of just everything.
Yeah, so, I got a lot of games.
That is not going to be a criteria necessarily for Sen. But I know for myself, it's funny. The quote was that there's more duos than trios in the world, but that might be true if you game a lot with like a significant other. But like, for instance, myself, I almost exclusively, when I play games with Tanya, it's with more people. Like, we play games for social. So most of the time it is 3 or more. So 2-player is actually not a big deal to me. I rarely play 2-player only, and only times I do is when I want to play my 2-player only games. I obviously have no other option. I mean, I joked, I haven't actually done it yet, but Akrotiri is an example of, like, I love Akrotiri. It's a great 2-player only game. I need to buy another copy so that I can play it with more players.
Well, before you do that, let me give a plug. So, the new Akrotiri is coming out. Ta-da! And the new Akrotiri will have different colored ships.
Yes.
Specifically for that reason. And Jay and I are currently, as of now, I should actually be working on it. The 3 to 4-player rules, which are not very different. It's just in terms of setup. Yeah. So, just how many tiles and things like that. Yeah.
I didn't even know that to set that up.
I know, right?
That's
perfect. It's interesting.
We streamed it. I don't know if you watched.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.
One of the questions, somebody was like, this seems like you could do 3 to 4. And we were like, I mean, yeah, but the size of the map would be massive. So now I'm really excited.
Well, tell the Sen, why don't you tell the backstory on that one?
Oh, it was actually made for 2 to 5. When we designed it, that was a 2 to 5 player game, and it still can play with 2 to 5. What happened was Sophie picked it up, played it, loved it, but said, "There's no way," and this is in French. There's no way that I'm making this in for more than 2 players because I can't handle the downtime. And if you played it, you guys have all played it, you know that the downtime between turns can, sometimes get a little bit as you're pathing out, especially near the end when you really want to make that 7-point temple. It's, how can I get there? And in a 2-player game, it's not so bad. But if everybody was doing that, it could get to be a bit much. And so we realized that she was right. At first, Jay and I were like, oh, no, it has to be, and we're not going to sign this. And then we said, well, you know what? I think she's right. And in the end, she really was, because the game has found a very good supportive niche in the 2-player community, where in a 3 to 4 or 5-player community, it probably would have got lost amongst other games. And so now it's like, hey, there's an opportunity to make a new version of it that has the cards rebalanced, because a funny story is we didn't actually rebalance for 2 players. We kept the balance for 5. And so there's 1 or 2 cards in there. Like when you play, you'll notice that, hey, why is this worth 7? That's really easy to get.
You can really get.
You can get it
that's
easily,
how
right?
I totally kill Steve usually at that game.
Right, because, and the reason why is because if you have a turn, and then Steve has a turn, and then you have a turn, you can finish that goal faster than if somebody else, if 2 other people, or even one other person messes up your turn, messes up your strategy, right, in between your plays. So we've nixed that one a little bit. We've adjusted some points here and there to better fit the 2 to 4 player experience, I feel. So that's that game. So yeah, a lot of times player count is super important. And so the idea, I think the idea that Gil brought up in regards to scope, that's from Matt and everybody else in the other guild. Brilliant stuff, Matt Wolf. Let's actually like read up on that stuff and see where it goes from there in terms of, does that inform design decisions? And I think it really will when you read it. At front, most of us design from feel anyways, and we kind of, oh yeah, that feels right and that feels right. But now I think this gives us an opportunity to look at it in a much more, what we'd call in science, a theoretical lens. So we have a theoretical perspective by which a framework that guides our design process. And I think that's brilliant. So I'm really happy that they've come up with that, and we can further refine it, right? It's a living thing. We can.
Well, I think all designers crave restraints. We either make them for ourselves or we look for direction. And so an important restraint is thinking through player count. I know for myself, there was a time when one publisher was really asking for games that were not party, they were strategy, and yet could be played up to 7 players. And you think about that all of a sudden is going to make a lot of important decisions for you if you start thinking through what can be done and what you probably shouldn't do when trying to have that many people around the table playing a game, and you want it to be done in a time that is satisfying and in a time that everyone can make important decisions, but meaningful decisions, but also not be falling asleep when it's someone else's someone else's turn. So how are you going to make players engaged, for instance, when it's not their turn, or how are you going to get player interaction to work? Gil used the great example of Take It Easy as something where you can have almost no player interaction. You can do that and have a really great time, but you're restricted to probably 20 minutes. You can't make a game that does, solo play for more than 20 minutes before everyone around the table kind of goes like, oh, wait, why are you here?
It becomes like bingo, right?
Right.
Which is fun in some ways because they're actually more interesting than bingo. So there's a couple other games like Karuba, Limes, which is an awesome 2-player game that you can play with unlimited amount of players. Right? Those types of games are brilliant for this format. And so is a game like Pandemic, right? Because we play Pandemic Survival, where we have many tables lined up. We start them the same. We have one deck that we play from. And those types of games can be brilliant because they can get people doing the same thing at the same time, but with different results. And all you're really doing is comparing the different results, which is actually kind of cool. See if you did better than the person next to you or whatever. And so I think there's definitely a place for those types of games. I'd like to design one myself. I've never even tried or thought about what's a game that we can play where everybody does exactly the same thing, but they don't actually have to be even in the same room.
Yeah.
Or, whatever. They just each have to have a set of the pieces and they can play the game.
Yeah.
So multiplayer solitaire, but in a good way. I think there's games where, we'd like it to be multiplayer solitaire, or it is multiplayer solitaire, but the game itself feels like it needs interaction.
Yeah.
And then there's games that are so clean and efficient, like the Karuba or Limes, where it's like, no, this game is fine as it is. We don't need to have interaction, and I'm fine playing with it for the 20 to 15 minutes that it takes, right? And if you ask like Evan Derrick and AJ Porfirino from Van Ryder Games, their specialty is actually like solo games.
Hostage Negotiator.
Yeah, Hostage Negotiation and other games. They'll actually say, yeah, make it play in 15 to 20 because ain't nobody want to play a solo game much longer than that.
Yeah.
at that level, right?
On the solo front, we got to give a shout out to friends of ours, Low Player Count podcast.
Yeah,
they do a great job of looking at games from that perspective, and so we want to give them a plug. Love what they do. Also, I'm going to shamelessly give a plug for Sagrada, which I think is a game
What's that?
does. It's a dice game on Kickstarter, and it's a game that was designed where we had to really tackle the question of multiplayer solitaire, but with interaction being subtle, and yet because we use the mechanic of drafting, which is one of my favorite mechanics, but we are drafting dice. There is that interaction, but you're still building your own thing, and I think again it scales really well, and it's my favorite game that I've been part of designing. I co-designed that with Adrian Adamskew, and it's my favorite game with a one-player variant. And the one-player variant, actually, Adrian came up with, and the minute we sat down and tested it, we were like, oh, wow, now maybe my favorite is playing this one-player. But we also love it at the 2, 3, and 4-player count. We even played around with 5, but we cut that because we didn't think it was ideal for downtime.
And componentry, right?
And componentry and control. You'd have to play with smaller windows, etc. But the reality is that there's certain games that just beg for they need more interaction or less, and you want to still follow the fun. It's not a complete science. There's art here, but I think there's some tools we can use that we're learning from each other as we develop, more discussion on how to design well.
That's a neat question, actually, coming off of that one. Just when you're designing or playing, do you like games that, where everybody gets this exact same number of turns, or when we have a set of components and that's what we use up, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And almost the end triggers or what are satisfying endings to games. Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you had a 3-player game versus a 4-player game, where the 3-player game was almost 1.5 times the length, so a game like Bargain Hunter, Schnappenjagd, Uwe's game, where a 3-player game you play 2 rounds, and a 4-player game you only play 1 round. What's more satisfying, and what do you like? I mean, it's actually a great 3-player game. It's not as good as a 4-player game because you have more time to do things,
to build up that narrative.
Yeah, to build up, of collecting crazy-looking toasters and hair dryers with eyeballs. That's what the game's about. Yeah.
Cool.
Tiff, what are your thoughts?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention before we wrap. I just want to give a plug for next week's episode.
Oh yeah, sure.
We hadn't mentioned it, but we're going to be talking about good rule books, and we're going to actually turn to a couple of non-designers again to add to our discussion. But this time it's going to be Lance Undead Viking Mixer and Rodney Smith.
That guy? Oh, he's Canadian. He's all right.
And so they'll be joining us again. A couple more reviewers. Trust us. We'll be getting lots of designers too, but we'll pick their brains a bit because they have clearly read lots of rule books, and I'm sure they have lots of opinions of what makes a good and a poor rule book. And especially, I think it's going to be helpful with Rodney, who, I mean, most of us would agree is one of the experts on teaching a game with his Watch It Played video stream. So I think that's one of the most important hurdles is us thinking through rule books and how to do that well as designers. So we're going to have both Lance and Rodney on the show to talk about that topic. But Tiffany, do you want the last word before we wrap up here?
Well, I have more than one word. That's the biggest
problem. Say all the words.
Say all the words. You get all the words today.
Well, I mean, we talked the player count discussion when we first, I'm going to be really honest, when we first jumped into this episode this morning, I messaged you guys and I was like, I don't even know. Yeah, I was like, I don't even know what I would ask.
How is this an episode?
Well, I didn't say that.
I know.
But it's one of those things that I think that a lot of people underestimate when it comes to, from a consumer perspective and also a reviewer perspective. Really, I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of work that goes into making varied player counts work, and being able to jump from 2-player to 5-player. Because one of the things that I see a lot on Kickstarters, and I kind of mentioned this in one of my questions to Gil, is that like the Kickstarter will be announced and it'll be like, oh, this is how many players we have, and then like immediately people start asking comments like, are you gonna do X number of players? What about adding another player? What about removing players? Like, and it's one of those things where I feel like people just really don't get how much work goes into designing for other player counts. And I also feel that
they don't. It's like you said, it's like making a whole other game.
Yeah, and I feel like as we have a lot of designers that are new and they are just people that were really enjoying the hobby and as consumers or reviewers, and they're branching into design and they come in with that mindset of, oh, well, we'll just make it more players. But a lot goes into balancing and playing, like just the cards that you mentioned for Akrateria, about how there's cards that are essentially unbalanced for 2-player, which is true. It just really blows me away, and I wish that more people were aware. Like, I want to make like an ad campaign talking about player counts at this point.
That's
player
what this episode is. That's
yeah,
what this episode is.
me. Good job, Gil. Yeah, Jeremy, good job, guys.
You made an advocate out of Tiff.
Yeah,
and it's true, because a lot of the Kickstarter stuff that comes through, eventually you get it, and it's like, well, did they really play test it at this player count? And I mean, Kickstarter people have a lot of stress. There's a lot of constraints in terms of, backers want this. If we don't do this, they won't back. But if we make it, it'll take us longer. But if we don't get it out on time, then they're never going to support us again. So we'll get this out in time. And really, is it as good as it could be? And I think that's what ultimately is what fails, is that there's less playtesting because, as you said, as a novice game designer or a novice publisher, a lot of them are first timers. Even if they're super successful, they're strictly first timers, second timers, where it fails because they didn't do enough playtesting at the different player counts.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
And it's one of those things that as a reviewer, I often play games and I'm just like, did they even test this? And I used to give a lot of crap for people for designs that just didn't do well for 2-player, and I feel that one, they might deserve it, and two, maybe they don't.
It's that tension, right? So just like at the end, Gil's advice was, try to spread out your player count as much as you can, because you're seeing, on a consumer standpoint, people want that. But at the same time, don't lie about your player count.
That's huge.
You need to do a good job of adapting the game and adapting the rules. And yet there's all these tensions, right? Because the minute you adapt your rules for different player counts, people are going to complain, which we'll talk about in rule books, about, all these different rules for different player counts. Some games are only certain player counts. So maybe also we need to be open-minded to maybe this is only a 3-player game, and when I have 3 players, I turn to that as one of my options. Or
one of my favorite suggestions, I think, was somebody said on BGG we should actually have a sweet spot number.
Well, there is plays best with. Right? Yeah.
But that wasn't originally there,
okay.
It was I don't think it was originally there. I think for a long time that was just not there, and I think it's very important. Well, actually, no, not on BGG. Sorry, on your game box itself.
Nice. Yeah.
Well, because that's one of the things that people ask me quite frequently.
Sure.
When it comes to games, they're like, "What does it play best as?" So yeah, I feel like that's worth it.
And it eventually gets out there, but the problem is people having a negative first-time experience.
Yeah.
I mean, the classic example that we talked about briefly on the show was Grand Austria Hotel. I played that the first time right at Sasquatch, and I played it right after SN, and I was really psyched about it. I played a 4-player game. Within one turn, I instantly knew this is a problem. And so I turned, and there was a game being played to my left that was just starting, and I said, can I join? I'll play both at the same time, and I did. And I played both games, and I never annoyed people on my left because I had enough downtime that I was fully engaged with the other game at the same time.
Yeah. That's kind of crazy.
I was like, oh, man, this is horrible, this Grand Austria Hotel. I loved what was going on in the game, but the downtime was horrible. I played it. I ended up picking up a copy and playing it 2-player, and right after I played that 2-player experience, I loved it. And 3-player, I still really enjoy it. So that's a classic example of a game of, if my only experience was the 4, I may have just hated it, wrote it off, and never went back to it.
Yeah, I mean that's the same with my experience with Panamax. My brain, because Grand Austria is, if you're not familiar, it's a action selection game where you roll dice and you put the dice on the grid and those determine what actions you can take, and you're picking 2 actions, but it uses a snake pattern. So there's a good amount of downtime at 4-player because of the snake and the dice. So I was thinking, well, what else is another dice drafting game? And I went to Panamax, and when Steve and I first played Panamax, we played 4-player, I believe, and we loved it because there's so much interaction with your ships in the canals and pushing and stuff. And so we had a copy, so we went home and we played 2-player, and it just like for us, it just completely. And it was because you lose that player interaction. With the pushing of the canals, even though the downtime was significantly less. So
important.
That's an interesting point as well, right? Because a lot of people think about downtime as being the only bad thing, whereas no, lack of interaction is also a bad thing, right? And you can trade that off amongst the two, or there's probably even more factors as well, right? But downtime itself is not the bad thing.
Especially if the downtime. It really depends on the game, because there's certain games that I've played where there are huge downtime, but you need that because you're thinking about so much. Yeah, and Grand Austria is a game where you don't need that much downtime because honestly, by the time, if you're in a 4-player game, by the time your turn comes back to you, the board has completely changed.
Yeah, the game state is really important. If it's chaotic in a non-fun way in that downtime, you feel totally unengaged because why bother paying attention?
Yeah, exactly. Disengagement. Daryl played another game, basically.
To use Gil's term that he was using a lot, if the global scope of the game is so large and the players can cause so many changes on their turns, it adds a disinterest factor for other players because on their turn the board will be completely different anyway, so why pay attention to the global scope?
And in a 4-player game, if you're disinterested for 3/4 of it, that's not a good sign. You're interested on your turn, which is why in a 2-player game you can have that, because 50% of the time you're actually interested. But if you can make a 2-player game where you're actually interested in what the other person's doing as well, then you got your winner, right? That's a good sign of a game.
Yep.
Daryl,
so on that note, that sounds great. We got to wrap it up. Clearly, we hit a good nerve, a good topic, had some great guests, and we're really thankful for them. Thank you, both Sen and Tiff, joining me as we take on this journey, this new season of Meeple Syrup Show. We want to say thanks to everyone who's watching. Keep interacting with us and sharing with us your thoughts. Join us when the shows are live and give us your questions, or you can hit us up beforehand if you like. If you have a question in mind on rules, send us this week and we can use that as we chat with both Lance and Rodney. So then, keep making great games, and we look forward to playing your game soon.
See ya.
Bye.